Before anything else, understand this clearly. Royal marriages were never celebrations. They were negotiations conducted on living bodies. And the most dangerous moment was not the wedding night itself. It was the night before. The night that never made it into frescoes, never inspired troubadours, never survived in official chronicles. Because writing it plainly would have revealed how power truly functioned. Across medieval Europe, inside palaces heavy with incense and guarded by steel alliances were not sealed with vows. They were sealed through verification. A princess was not immediately given to her future husband. She was delayed, isolated, removed from ceremony and spectacle, and placed into a shadowed interval that had no official name. A night that technically did not exist. Historians hesitate to label it a ritual. The Church avoids defining it. Legal records stop abruptly before it begins. But the traces remain small, nervous, and telling. In the 11th century, within a Norman marriage register, a monk known today as Guillaume of Jumièges added a marginal note so brief it was nearly invisible. The bride has not yet been delivered. Not married. Not joined. Delivered. In medieval legal language, delivery referred not to ceremony but to authorization. It meant the body had not yet been approved for dynastic use. In royal Europe, virginity was not a private virtue. It was a political condition. Bloodlines were currency. Succession was fragile. One disputed heir could shatter alliances, ignite civil war, or collapse an entire dynasty. That is why no royal bride was permitted to approach marriage unquestioned. In Norman England, ecclesiastical archives refer discreetly to women called testes pudicitiae, witnesses of purity. They were elderly, socially invisible, often associated with religious institutions, but operating outside monastic protection. Their role was not spiritual guidance. It was inspection. Later church writers attempted to soften these descriptions, reframing them as symbolic assurances. But surviving letters contradict this. They speak of delay, verification, and bodily certainty. When Matilda of Flanders was set to marry William of Normandy, the ceremony was postponed unexpectedly. A letter from the Archbishop of Rouen confirms the delay, stating that the union could not proceed until the required rite for the honor of the crown was completed. The rite itself is never described, but without it, even a duke could not marry. In Capetian France, the process became standardized. On the night before a royal wedding, the princess was escorted away not toward her husband, but into a sealed chamber. The groom was explicitly forbidden entry. Instead, officials of the crown and representatives of ecclesiastical authority were present. A manuscript preserved in the Vatican Library uses an unsettling term to describe this process: probatio regis, the trial of the king. But the king was never examined. The trial was imposed entirely upon the woman. Her body was evaluated not for desire, but for risk. Any indication of prior contact, any irregularity, any ambiguity could invalidate the marriage before dawn. She was not treated as a future queen, but as a vessel whose integrity determined the fate of kingdoms. And sometimes, scrutiny was not enough. In 13th century Aragonese court records, scribes cautiously refer to a procedure called the night of preparation. No actions are described, no witnesses named, only the result is noted. She emerged silent, the record states, and entered a wife. In medieval documentation, silence is never neutral. It signifies completion. Within the Holy Roman Empire, surviving correspondence reveals an even harsher reality. Certain princesses were forced to swear formal oaths, never to speak of what occurred prior to their marriage. The penalty for violation was excommunication. At the time, excommunication was not merely spiritual punishment. It erased a person legally, socially, and politically. An excommunicated woman could not testify, inherit, or seek protection. She effectively ceased to exist. The fear driving these practices was absolute. Dynastic legitimacy was fragile theater. One child of uncertain origin could invalidate decades of treaties. Europe had already seen wars erupt over whispered doubts. And so the system ensured submission before union. Not only physical compliance, but psychological destruction. By the time the princess was delivered to her husband, she understood a permanent truth. Her body no longer belonged to her, and never would again. German legal manuscripts reference a final, unnamed step ominously titled the Night of Transfer. No description survives, but its consequences are clear. After this night, the princess disappears from council records. Her opinions vanish. Her signature never appears again. She is no longer consulted. She is recorded only as secured. She stops being a person. She becomes a guarantee. And here lies the most dangerous truth, one most chronicles carefully avoid. In rare cases, the rites failed. When they did, the marriage did not proceed. Instead, the bride vanished. Marriage contracts quietly annulled. Genealogies revised. Names erased between one document and the next. Daughters of kings who entered that night and were never seen again. No funerals recorded. No accusations filed. No crimes acknowledged. Because death created questions. Silence did not. And in the next part of this investigation, we will uncover what truly happened when royal bodies failed their trials, why imprisonment, cloistering, and total erasure were preferred over execution. Because in medieval power structures, there was something worse than dying, being erased. And yet, some names survived. Not as queens, not as wives, but as gaps. Absences so precise, they became impossible to ignore. Because while chronicles learned how to erase women quietly, they were never perfect. And sometimes, the silence itself betrayed them. In the early 12th century, England recorded the existence of a princess named Matilda, of Scotland's younger cousin, known only as Ailiva in a handful of court letters. She was educated at Wilton Abbey, prepared for marriage into a Norman-aligned house, and formally presented at court. Then, the records fracture. A proposed marriage is mentioned. A dowry is calculated. And then nothing. No marriage certificate. No death record. No convent admission. Ailiva vanishes between preparation and ceremony. The next surviving document simply removes her name from the line of consideration, as if she had never existed. In Capetian France, a more disturbing case emerges. Agnes of Burgundy, a minor royal cousin raised within the orbit of King Philip I, was documented extensively during her childhood. Court poets mention her beauty. Abbey records list her education. A diplomatic letter from 1096 notes her suitability for alliance. Then, abruptly, her name ceases to appear. Not crossed out. Not explained. Simply, absent. Later, genealogies quietly reduce the number of royal daughters born that decade, adjusting history retroactively. In the Holy Roman Empire, the disappearance of Judith of Swabia is more visible and more alarming. Judith was betrothed to a northern Italian noble house in the late 11th century. Imperial correspondence confirms her transport toward the border. Escorts are named, expenses recorded. But the marriage never occurs. A later imperial letter states only that the arrangement was rendered unnecessary. Unnecessary. No illness is cited. No death acknowledged. No convent listed. Judith does not reappear in any surviving document, imperial, ecclesiastical, or local. In Aragon, 13th century registers mention a royal daughter known as Elvira of Aragon, prepared for marriage into a Castilian alliance. She undergoes what the record calls final preparation. The next line reads, "The alliance was resolved by other means." Elvira is never mentioned again. Not in Castilian records. Not in Aragonese burial rolls. Not among religious vows. It is as if the night consumed her. Historians later speculated illness. Others suggested private vows. But no evidence supports either. What does survive is a revised genealogy, one fewer daughter than previously recorded. And then there is the case scholars still struggle to explain. Adelaide of Lorraine. Adelaide was a documented noblewoman of imperial blood, raised openly at court, cited in multiple diplomatic correspondences, and promised in marriage to an Italian margrave. Preparations are detailed. Gifts exchanged. Dates set. On the eve of the union, a single annotation appears in a margin. Negotiations discontinued. The marriage is cancelled. Adelaide is never mentioned again, not even as deceased. Which is the point. Because medieval systems had learned something crucial. Death left traces. Bodies required burial. Burials required rites. Rites required witnesses. But disappearance required nothing at all. When a princess failed her trial, whether through rumor, suspicion, resistance, or political inconvenience, execution was dangerous. Imprisonment created witnesses. Convents created records. But erasure was clean. A woman removed from lineage. A name removed from parchment. A body absorbed into silence. Some were likely confined for life under different identities. Others absorbed into religious houses under false names. Some never recorded again in any form. The system did not need to kill them. It only needed to make sure. They were never spoken of. And this is why medieval marriage rituals were surrounded by fear, secrecy, and threat, not because they were symbolic, but because they were mechanisms of control. The princess who entered that hidden night understood one final truth. Her survival depended on obedience. Her memory depended on success. Failure meant becoming a blank space in history. No grave, no legend, no warning, just absence. And perhaps that is why the chronicles feel uneasy when they approach these nights. Why sentences trail off. Why margins carry more truth than pages. Why historians still hesitate to speak plainly. Because these were not anomalies. They were procedures. And they worked. Before you hear the next fairy tale of crowns and white dresses, remember the women who never reached the altar. The ones who entered the night before the wedding and never came back. If this story unsettled you, good. Because history is not meant to comfort. Subscribe now. Follow for the next investigation. Because the darkest chapters of the past were not written to be remembered. They were written to be erased. And we are just beginning to read what was never meant to survive.